A millionaire was accustomed to owning valuable pedigree animals. One day he despises and abandons a newborn blind puppy. The small animal was left to fend for itself in a remote forest, without any hope. However, a little girl who witnessed the scene from a distance decides to intervene, rescuing it and in the end moving everyone. Before you get to know this touching story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the imposing mansion of the Andersons, Edward observed with contempt the small newborn puppy that his champion golden retriever bitch had given birth to. Among the 5 puppies in the litter, only one was born different. Its eyes, permanently closed, indicated a condition that made it imperfect in the eyes of the professional breeder. "I can't keep an animal like this in my kennel," declared Edward, adjusting his Italian silk tie. "It would tarnish my reputation in the show circuit. Rodriguez, take care of this immediately." The employee, a middle-aged man who had worked in the kennel for years, felt his heart tighten. He knew the boss's methods well. Any animal that didn't meet the rigorous standards was discarded without mercy. With trembling hands, he picked up the small puppy, which snuggled in his arms, oblivious to the fate that awaited it. That same afternoon, in an area far from the city near the forest that surrounded the humble neighborhood of Hope Valley, Sarah, a 12-year-old girl, was returning from school along her usual path. Her brown hair, tied in a simple braid, swayed as she walked, carrying her worn backpack. Despite financial difficulties, Sarah maintained a constant smile on her face, a legacy from her mother, Mrs. Davis, who raised her daughter alone, working as a seamstress. It was then that an almost imperceptible sound caught her attention, a small whimper coming from behind a bush. Sarah approached cautiously, and her heart almost stopped when she found a tiny golden retriever puppy shivering from cold and hunger. "Who would be capable of abandoning such a beautiful little thing?" she murmured, immediately noticing that the puppy kept its eyes closed. With all gentleness, she wrapped the small animal in her school jacket and cradled it close to her chest. At home, Mrs. Davis initially hesitated when she saw her daughter with the puppy. "Sarah, you know we can barely support ourselves." "Mom, please. He'll die if we don't take care of him. Look, he's blind. He needs special help," Sarah argued, her brown eyes shining with determination. "I'm going to call him Ray because even without seeing, he's going to light up our lives." Mrs. Davis, recognizing in her daughter's gaze the same strength she herself had when she was young, finally gave in. "All right, but you'll be responsible for him." In the weeks that followed, Sarah devoted herself entirely to Ray's care. She researched blind dogs at the public library, talked to neighborhood veterinarians who, moved by her dedication, offered consultations at affordable prices, and developed her own techniques to help the puppy adapt to the world. She created a system of different sounds for each command. A soft whistle meant food, 2 claps indicated walk time, and a finger snap served as a call. Ray responded with surprising intelligence, exceeding everyone's expectations. The small backyard of the house was transformed into an improvised training area. Sarah placed different textures on the ground, rugs, cushions, smooth stones, for Ray to learn to identify environments by touch. She installed small bells at strategic points, which tinkled with the breeze and helped the dog orient itself spatially. At night, while her mother sewed in the living room, Sarah read books aloud to Ray, who snuggled in her lap, attentive to every word. "Did you know that dogs can understand more than 150 different words?" she would comment excitedly to her mother. "Ray already knows at least 50. The bond between the two grew every day. Ray developed an extraordinary sensitivity to perceive Sarah's emotions. When she came home sad from school, he would approach slowly, touching his nose to her hand until he made her smile. On happy days, he matched her energy, running and playing in the backyard with coordination that impressed the neighbors. On one particular afternoon, while training in the backyard, Sarah noticed something extraordinary. Ray wasn't just overcoming his obstacles, he seemed to flourish through them. The dog had developed a unique agility, using his other senses in an exceptional way. He could catch balls in the air guided only by sound, avoid obstacles by perceiving the slightest changes in the wind, and demonstrated impressive motor coordination. "Mom, isn't Ray amazing?" Sarah would constantly ask, marveling at each new achievement of her friend. "He doesn't need eyes to see the world. He feels everything in a special way." Mrs. Davis observed the transformation not only of the dog, but mainly of her daughter. Sarah, who had always been a determined girl, had developed even greater maturity and sensitivity. The project of helping Ray had transformed into a mission that revealed the best of her character. The news about the blind dog that performed feats began to spread throughout the neighborhood. Children from the neighborhood would appear to see Ray in action, and Sarah, proud, would demonstrate how he could complete small obstacle courses that she set up in the backyard. It was during one of these demonstrations that a neighbor, a physical education teacher, made a suggestion that would forever change the course of Sarah and Ray's fate. Have you ever thought about participating in canine agility competitions? Your dog has a natural talent. Sarah felt her heart race at the possibility. Would it be possible? A blind dog participating in competitions? The idea seemed too daring, but something inside her said that Ray was capable of much more than anyone could imagine. That night, lying in her simple bed, with Ray sleeping at her feet, Sarah began to dream of possibilities she had never considered before. Her small companion, whom she had found abandoned and frightened, could become an example of overcoming for the world. What Sarah didn't know yet was that her journey with Ray was just beginning, and that fate held even greater surprises for that unlikely pair. The special bond between a girl with a giant heart and a dog that soared with its soul was about to inspire many more people than she could imagine. Mr. Thompson, who had suggested the competitions, began to appear regularly in Sarah's backyard to observe the training sessions with Ray. Impressed with the unique connection between the girl and the dog, he offered to help them develop a more structured training program. "Sarah, you've created incredible techniques by intuition," he explained, while watching Ray complete the small backyard circuit once again. "But with some adjustments, you can go much further." Saturday mornings transformed into intensive training sessions. Mr. Thompson brought basic equipment, tubes, jump bars, and tires, which were adapted with sound devices to guide Ray. Sarah absorbed every piece of information like a sponge, always looking for ways to improve communication with her companion. Mrs. Davis, initially concerned about the time her daughter devoted to training, began to notice positive changes in Sarah. Her grades at school improved as she applied the same discipline from training to her studies. Her self-confidence grew with each new challenge overcome with Ray. "Mum, I found a regional canine agility competition that's going to happen in 3 months," Sarah announced during dinner, her eyes shining with expectation. "Mr. Thompson thinks we're ready to participate." The news brought both enthusiasm and concern. The registrations weren't cheap, and there were costs for transportation and proper equipment. Mrs. Davis bit her lip, mentally calculating. "We can do it," said Sarah, noticing her mother's concern. "I can help you with the sewing after school, and Mr. Thompson said he knows people who can lend some equipment." Sarah's determination infected the neighborhood. A community fundraiser was organized, complete with a bake sale and charity bazaar. Mr. Johnson, the grocery store owner, offered to sponsor part of the registration. Mrs. Bennett, a retired teacher, sewed a special vest for Ray, with small bells strategically positioned. The training intensified. Sarah woke up earlier to practice before school, and Ray responded with contagious enthusiasm. The small backyard was no longer enough, so Mr. Thompson got permission to use the neighborhood soccer field during free hours. It was during one of these training sessions that Sarah discovered something extraordinary about Ray. In addition to his incredible ability to orient himself by sound and vibration, he had developed a kind of sixth sense to predict the necessary movements. It was as if he could read Sarah's intentions through subtle changes in her energy. "It's incredible," exclaimed Mr. Thompson, filming the training sessions with his old cell phone. "He's not just following commands, he's truly connected with you, Sarah. This is rare even among dogs that can see." The news about the blind dog preparing for an official competition began to circulate beyond the neighborhood limits. A local newspaper sent a reporter to do a story, and soon Sarah and Ray's story was on social media, touching hearts and inspiring people. As the competition date approached, nerves began to surface. Sarah spent hours studying the regulations, memorizing every possible rule and penalty. Ray, sensing his owner's anxiety, became even more attentive, always finding ways to make her smile. "What if people don't accept a blind dog in the competition?" Sarah asked one night, while petting Ray on her bed. "Honey," Mrs. Davis replied, sitting next to her, You've already proven that you're capable of things no one believed possible. Don't let fear of judgments take that away from you. On the eve of the competition, the entire neighborhood seemed in an uproar. A small caravan was organized to accompany Sarah and Ray to the city's exhibition center. Banners were made, and even an improvised uniform was created for the Hope Valley Cheer Squad. That night, lying in her bed, Sarah reflected on the journey up to that point. She remembered the day she found Ray, so small and scared, and how that encounter had completely changed her life. It was no longer just about winning a competition. It was about showing the world that limitations are just challenges to be overcome. "Tomorrow is the big day, Ray," she whispered as the dog rested his head on her lap. "But no matter what happens, you're already a champion to me." What Sarah didn't know was that among those registered to watch the next day's competition was a name that would completely change the course of her story. Edward Anderson, the breeder who had ordered Ray's abandonment months ago. Fate was about to create an encounter that no one could have predicted, and the consequences would be much greater than anyone could imagine. The exhibition center was buzzing with activity on that Saturday morning. Dozens of competitors and their dogs circulated through the venue, some with sophisticated equipment and sponsored uniforms. Sarah, wearing the simple uniform sewn by her mother, held Ray's leash firmly, trying to control her nervousness. "Remember what we practiced," Mr. Thompson guided, helping her recognize the course. "You have 5 minutes for familiarization before the presentation. Use that time for Ray to feel the textures and sounds of the circuit." The presence of the Hope Valley Cheer Squad in the stands gave Sarah an extra dose of courage. Mrs. Davis, seated in the front row, held a rosary between her fingers, murmuring silent prayers. Mr. Johnson from the grocery store had closed his establishment for the first time in 15 years to be there. On the other side of the arena, Edward Anderson observed the competitors with his usual air of superiority. His dogs always dominated these competitions, and he was there to supervise the participation of his newest champion, a pedigree border collie. "Number 47, Sarah Davis and Ray," announced the loudspeaker. "Please proceed to the preparation area." The buzz in the arena increased when Sarah and Ray entered. Some competitors whispered, pointing to the golden retriever that kept its eyes closed. The judges exchanged confused looks, consulting the regulations. "Gentlemen judges, Mr." Thompson stepped forward, presenting the necessary documentation. "There is no rule that prevents the participation of a dog with visual impairment, as long as it meets all health and training requirements, which Ray fully complies with." Edward, who until then had kept his attention on his own dog, turned to the arena upon hearing the dog's name. Something about that golden retriever seemed familiar to him, but he dismissed the thought, considering it impossible that it could be the same puppy he had ordered to be discarded. The recognition time began. Sarah gently guided Ray through the course, allowing him to feel each obstacle. Her fingers drummed softly on his back using a code they had developed together. Each touch represented a different type of obstacle. "Look at that," commented one of the judges, impressed. "The dog is mapping the course through touch and hearing." The audience watched in respectful silence, many touched by the delicacy of the connection between the girl and her dog. Edward, now more attentive, began to notice distinctive characteristics in the golden retriever: the small white mark under the chin, the peculiar shape of the ears. The signal sounded, indicating the start of the presentation. Sarah took a deep breath, knelt beside Ray, and whispered in his ear, "It's just you and me, buddy. Like it's always been." What followed left the arena in a state of admiration. Ray moved with a grace that defied his condition. Each obstacle was overcome with millimetric precision, guided by Sarah's soft voice and the sound system they had practiced exhaustively. The ramp was conquered with elegance, the jumps executed perfectly, and the slalom completed at a pace that many sighted dogs would have difficulty maintaining. But it was on the elevated bridge that Ray truly shone, crossing it with a confidence that drew spontaneous applause from the audience. Edward was paralyzed. Memories of the day he ordered the abandonment of the blind puppy came back with full force. His face paled as he recognized, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was the same dog. "Impossible," he murmured, watching Ray complete another perfect sequence of obstacles. The dog he had judged worthless was proving to be an exceptional athlete, challenging all prejudices and limitations imposed. The presentation came to an end with Sarah and Ray crossing the finish line in an impressive time. The audience exploded in applause. Tears ran down Mrs. Davis's face, while the Hope Valley cheer squad waved their handmade banners. The judges gathered, animatedly discussing. What they had just witnessed went beyond technique. It was a demonstration of overcoming and partnership that transcended the usual standards of competition. Edward rose from his seat, his mind in turmoil. Remorse mixed with a sudden commercial interest. That dog, which he had discarded as defective, had proven to be a unique and valuable specimen. Sarah, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the stands, hugged Ray, covering him with praise and caresses. For her, regardless of the result, that moment was already a victory. Her friend had shown the world that there are no limits for those who have love and determination. What no one knew was that that presentation would be just the beginning of a much greater battle. Edward Anderson was already making plans in his mind, and his actions in the coming days would test not only the strength of the bond between Sarah and Ray, but also the values of an entire community. The days that followed the competition were filled with intense joy for Sarah and the Hope Valley community. The duo had not only completed the course with mastery, but had also won third place overall, an extraordinary feat for newcomers, especially considering Ray's unique condition. The trophy, modest in size but gigantic in significance, occupied a place of honor in the living room of Sarah's small house. Mrs. Davis couldn't contain her pride, sharing the story with every client who came to place sewing orders. However, while Hope Valley celebrated, Edward Anderson was plotting his plans in the corridors of his mansion. The initial remorse for the decision to abandon Ray had been quickly replaced by a voracious ambition. He saw in the blind dog not just an opportunity for profit, but a chance to reaffirm his position as the best breeder in the circuit. On a sunny morning, while Sarah and Ray were practicing in the neighborhood soccer field, a luxurious car parked nearby. Edward, impeccably dressed, stepped out of the vehicle, attracting curious glances from the residents. "Sarah Davis," he called, approaching the field. "May we talk for a moment?" Sarah, recognizing him from the breeder magazines she used to flip through at the newsstand, felt a mixture of admiration and apprehension. "Yes, sir?" Edward got straight to the point. "I'm impressed with your dog's performance in the competition. I'd like to make an offer to buy him." The shock on Sarah's face was evident. Ray, sensing his owner's sudden tension, positioned himself protectively in front of her. "I'm sorry, sir," Sarah replied, her voice trembling but firm. "But Ray is not for sale. He's my friend, not an object." Edward, not accustomed to being contradicted, insisted, "I understand your attachment, but think carefully. I can offer an amount that would change your family's life. With my resources and contacts, Ray could become a world champion." The conversation attracted the attention of the neighbors. Mr. Thompson, who was overseeing the training, quickly approached. "Sarah," Mr. Thompson intervened, "you don't need to answer now. Why don't we all talk more calmly?" But Sarah was adamant. "There's nothing to think about, Mr. Thompson. Ray stays with me." Edward, visibly annoyed, changed tactics. "Very well, but know that this dog has a history you're unaware of. He was born in my kennel." The revelation fell like a bombshell. Sarah looked at Ray, then at Edward, connecting the dots. Was it you who abandoned him?" The silence that followed was tense. Edward, realizing he had revealed too much, tried to compose himself. "It was complicated circumstances. The important thing is that now I recognize his potential and want to offer the best conditions." Indignation took hold of Sarah. Tears of anger welled up in her eyes as she protectively hugged Beacon. "You threw him away like trash. Now that he's proven his worth, you want to buy him back?" "Never!" The commotion attracted more residents. Clara, alerted by a neighbor, arrived at the scene, breathless. "What's going on here?" Edward, realizing the situation was slipping out of his control, decided to retreat strategically. "Think about my offer, Sarah. I'll be back in a few days for a final answer." With that, he quickly retreated to his car, leaving behind a community in an uproar. In the days that followed, Hope Valley transformed into a hub of heated debates. Some argued that Edward's offer could bring much-needed resources to the community. Others fiercely defended Sarah's right to keep Beacon, seeing their story as a symbol of overcoming adversity and unconditional love. Sarah, at the center of the storm, felt the weight of the decision. She spent sleepless nights torn between the desire to provide a better life for her mother and the certainty that Beacon was much more than just a competition dog. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Sarah had an idea. If Edward wanted Beacon for his potential as a competitor, why not show the world that the dog's true value went far beyond competitions? With the help of Mr. Johnson, her teacher, and some school friends, Sarah began documenting her daily routine with Beacon. Videos showed how the dog helped visually impaired children in the neighborhood, how his presence calmed the elderly at the local nursing home, and how his story inspired people of all ages to overcome their own challenges. The social media campaign, initially modest, quickly gained momentum. The hashtag #Beacon is more than a champion spread, attracting the attention of influencers and personalities engaged in animal causes. Meanwhile, Edward prepared to return to Hope Valley, confident that his offer would be irresistible. What he didn't know was that he was about to face not just Sarah, but an entire community united around a cause greater than any monetary value could buy. The final confrontation was approaching, and with it, revelations that would forever change not only the fate of Beacon and Sarah, but society's perception of the true meaning of value and overcoming adversity. The day dawned with a different energy in Hope Valley. Residents gathered in small groups, talking in low tones and frequently glancing at the main street. The news that Edward Thompson would return to seek a final answer about Beacon had spread like wildfire, and the community was on alert. Sarah, sitting on the porch of her house with Beacon by her side, leafed through a photo album documenting her journey with the dog. Each image told a story of overcoming love and unconditional partnership. Clara watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. "Honey," she began softly, "whatever your decision, I'll be by your side." Sarah looked up, a glint of determination evident in her eyes. "Mom, there's no decision to be made. Beacon is part of our family. No amount of money can buy that." At that moment, the roar of a powerful engine broke the morning quiet. Edward's luxury car parked at the end of the street, attracting glances from everyone present. The businessman got out, adjusting his impeccable suit, a leather briefcase in hand. To his surprise, he found not just Sarah and her mother, but practically the entire community gathered. Determined faces stared at him, forming a protective barrier around the girl and her dog. "I see you've brought a welcoming committee," Edward commented, trying to maintain his composure. "Sarah, can we talk in private?" Before Sarah could respond, Mr. Johnson stepped forward. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it to all of us. This community is united." Edward cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Very well. Sarah, as I promised, I'm here to hear your final decision. My offer still stands, and I can even increase it if necessary." Sarah took a deep breath, exchanging a glance with Beacon before speaking. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your interest, but my answer remains the same. Beacon is not for sale." "Be reasonable, girl," Edward insisted, his frustration beginning to show. "Think about the future, the opportunities this money could provide." It was then that Sarah made a gesture, and Mr. Johnson brought over a laptop. "Before you continue, I'd like to show you something and everyone here present." On the screen, a video began to play, compiling the most memorable moments of Beacon's journey. Scenes from his initial training, his incredible performance in the competition, but more importantly, the impact he had on the community. Visually impaired children learning to navigate with Beacon's help, elderly people finding comfort in his presence, and emotional testimonials from people inspired by his story. As the video progressed, it was possible to see Edward's expression changing. What had begun as a commercial transaction in his mind was transforming into something much deeper. "This is Beacon's true value," Sarah explained, her voice choked with emotion. "He's not just a competition dog. He's a symbol of hope, of overcoming. He shows that our limitations don't define who we are." The silence that followed was broken by applause and murmurs of approval from the community. Edward remained quiet, clearly impacted by what he had just seen. I had no idea," he muttered finally. "When I ordered that blind puppy to be abandoned, I thought I was making a purely commercial decision. But I see now that I made a terrible mistake." The admission caught everyone by surprise. Edward continued, his voice now heavy with regret. Sarah, you and this community have taught me a lesson I'll never forget. The value of a life can't be measured in money or titles. Turning to face the crowd, Edward did something no one expected. I apologize to everyone, especially you, Beacon, he said, kneeling to be at the dog's height. I was the blind one, not you. The gesture deeply touched everyone present. Sarah, with tears in her eyes, placed a hand on Edward's shoulder. The important thing is that now you see. At that moment, something changed, not just in Edward, but in the entire community. What had begun as a conflict transformed into an opportunity for learning and growth for everyone. Edward stood up, a new determination in his gaze. Sarah, instead of buying Beacon, I'd like to propose something different. How about we work together to expand the impact you've already started here? I can use my resources to create training programs for assistance dogs, expand the reach of the work you do. The proposal was received with enthusiasm. In the months that followed, Hope Valley found itself at the center of an incredible transformation. What was a humble neighborhood became a reference hub for inclusion programs and animal-assisted therapy. Beacon, far from being just a trophy to be displayed, became an ambassador for a greater cause. His story inspired changes in competition regulations, making room for dogs with different abilities. Sarah, in turn, discovered a vocation that went beyond her connection with Beacon. She became a young leader, using her experience to inspire others to see beyond appearances and limitations. Edward Thompson's transformation did not go unnoticed in the world of dog breeders. His new focus on assistance and inclusion programs began to influence the entire industry, promoting a change in mentality about the value of animals beyond aesthetic or competitive standards. As the sun set over Hope Valley, now a place of renewed hope, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that a simple act of compassion had triggered. Beacon, lying at her feet, seemed to smile, as if fully understanding the impact his existence had caused on so many lives. 6 months passed since the confrontation that changed the course of Hope Valley. The neighborhood, previously known only for its simplicity, now buzzed with renewed energy. The Animal-Assisted Training and Therapy Center, fruit of the partnership between Edward Thompson and the community, had become the beating heart of the place. Sarah, now 14 years old, walked the corridors of the center, Beacon faithfully by her side. Her responsibilities had grown considerably. In addition to caring for Beacon and keeping up with her studies, she now assisted in training new dogs and actively participated in therapy programs. Sarah, we have a new class arriving today, announced Amanda, the center's coordinator. They're children from the Institute for the Blind in the capital. Do you think you and Beacon can lead the welcome session? Sarah's face lit up at the proposal. Of course. Beacon loves meeting new people, especially children. As they prepared for the group's arrival, Sarah reflected on how her life had changed. The simple room she shared with her mother now had a new desk, filled with books on animal behavior and assisted therapies. Clara, thanks to her new job as supervisor of the center's sewing department, which produced special vests for assistance dogs, was finally able to replace the old sewing machine with a modern one. The sound of a bus parking pulled Sarah from her thoughts. She adjusted Beacon's vest, now adorned with the center's logo, and headed to the entrance. The children, aged between 8 and 12, got off the bus with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Many had never interacted with an assistance dog before. Welcome to our center, Sarah greeted the group enthusiastically. My name is Sarah, and this is Beacon. He's super excited to meet all of you. One of the children, a boy of about 10, stepped forward, his cane tapping the ground. Is Beacon the famous dog that won the competition even though he's blind? Sarah smiled, gently guiding the boy's hand to touch Beacon. Exactly. And today he's going to show you that being different doesn't mean being less capable. The session that followed was magical. Sarah led the children through a series of activities that demonstrated Beacon's abilities. The dog navigated obstacles, found hidden objects, and even read commands in Braille, a new skill that Sarah had recently taught him. The children, initially shy, soon loosened up. Laughter echoed through the courtyard as they took turns guiding Beacon through small courses, marveling at the dog's confidence and skill. At the end of the session, many children didn't want to leave. Can we come back tomorrow? asked a girl, hugging Beacon affectionately. Of course you can, Sarah replied. In fact, we're starting a regular visitation program. Who knows, some of you might become trainers in the future. As the bus departed, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Edward Thompson, who had discreetly observed the entire session. Impressive as always, Sarah, he praised. I have exciting news. The National Canine Competition Federation has reached out. They want to use our story to promote changes in the rules, making competitions more inclusive. Sarah could barely contain her excitement. That's incredible! Does it mean more dogs like Beacon will have a chance to compete? Edward nodded, a twinkle in his eyes. Exactly, and there's more. They'd like you and Beacon to be the ambassadors for this new initiative. This would involve travel, lectures, demonstrations. Sarah's mind was spinning with the possibilities. Traveling, seeing new places, inspiring more people. It was a dream coming true. But a concern arose. What about school? And the center here? I've thought about that, Edward reassured her. We can organize a schedule that doesn't interfere with your studies. As for the center, your participation in this initiative will only bring more visibility and resources to our work here. That night, at home, Sarah shared the news with Clara. Her mother, with tears in her eyes, hugged her tightly. My daughter, look at you. From a girl who rescued an abandoned puppy to a young woman who's changing the world. I'm so proud. Sarah stroked Beacon, who was resting at her feet. All of this was only possible thanks to him, Mum. Beacon not only overcame his own limitations, he taught us all to see beyond appearances. As she prepared for bed, Sarah could hardly wait for what the future held. The journey that had begun in a simple backyard in Hope Valley was now expanding to horizons she had never imagined. Beacon, as if sensing his companion's excitement, rested his head on Sarah's lap, his eyes, though blind, seeming to shine with the promise of new adventures. The year that followed was a roller coaster of emotions and experiences for Sarah and Beacon. As ambassadors for the National Canine Competition Federation's new inclusion initiative, they traveled across the country, participating in events, giving lectures, and performing demonstrations that left audiences moved and inspired. In every city they visited, the duo left an indelible mark. Children with disabilities found in Beacon an example of overcoming adversity. Dog breeders rethought their concepts of value and potential. Local politicians were encouraged to create more inclusive laws for animals with special needs. Sarah, now 15, was growing not just in stature, but in maturity and eloquence. Her presentations, once timid and hesitant, now captivated large audiences. She had learned to balance her studies, which she partially did remotely with her new responsibilities. On a sunny afternoon in Washington, D.C., after a presentation at the Capitol, Sarah received news that left her breathless. Sarah, said Edward, holding an official envelope, the International Federation of Canine Sports wants you and Beacon to be Brazil's representatives at the World Congress for Animal Inclusion in Geneva, Switzerland. Sarah's eyes widened. Geneva? In Switzerland? But that's on the other side of the world. Edward smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. It's a unique opportunity. You would speak to delegates from over 100 countries, sharing your story and helping shape global policies for the inclusion of animals with disabilities. Sarah's mind was spinning. It was an unimaginable honor, but also a daunting challenge. Traveling to another continent, speaking at an international congress, it was a lot to absorb. That night, back in Hope Valley, Sarah shared the news with her mother. Clara, who had closely followed her daughter's transformation, felt a mix of pride and apprehension. "My daughter, you've grown so much," she said, hugging Sarah. "But an international trip is something big. Are you sure you're ready?" Sarah looked at Beacon, who was resting peacefully on the living room rug. "You know, Mom, a year ago I would have said no. But Beacon taught me that our limits are only where we decide to stop. If our story can help other animals and people around the world, how can we refuse?" The weeks leading up to the trip were intense. Sarah immersed herself in English lessons, prepared her presentation with the help of Edward and the center's team, and even learned some rudimentary French. "You never know when it might be useful," she joked. The big day finally arrived. The international airport in New York was bustling, but a small group stood out. Sarah, Beacon, Clara, Edward, and a small delegation from Hope Valley who had come to say goodbye. "Remember," said Edward, adjusting Beacon's special travel vest. "You're not just representing the United States. You're carrying the message that compassion and inclusion have no borders." With tears in her eyes, Clara hugged her daughter one last time before boarding. "I'm so proud of you, my love. Go and show the world the power of love and determination." The flight to Geneva was an adventure in itself. Beacon, accommodated at Sarah's feet in business class, courtesy of the Federation, remained calm throughout the journey, as if understanding the importance of the mission. Upon landing in Geneva, Sarah was greeted by Congress representatives. The city, with its stunning architecture and majestic Lake Geneva, seemed straight out of a postcard. At the hotel preparing for the first day of the Congress, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Kneeling beside Beacon, she whispered, "We're far from home, buddy, but our message is universal. Let's show them that the true value of a living being is in the heart, not in the eyes that see." The next morning, as she took the stage at the Congress, Sarah felt a surprising calm come over her. With Beacon by her side, she began her presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sarah, and this is Beacon. We come from a small community in the United States to share a great truth, that inclusion and love can illuminate even the darkest corners of the world." The words flowed with an eloquence that surprised even Sarah. The audience, composed of experts and authorities from around the world, listened in respectful silence, many visibly moved. At the end of the presentation, the ovation was deafening. Delegates approached to congratulate Sarah and Beacon, asking questions, taking photos, and, most importantly, promising to take that message back to their countries. That night, in her hotel room overlooking the lake, Sarah made a video call to her mother. "It was amazing, Mom," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with excitement. "People from all over the world wanting to know more about our work, about how they can implement similar programs." Clara, emotional, just smiled. "My little big hero. You're changing the world, Sarah." As she ended the call, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her here. From a girl who rescued an abandoned puppy to an international ambassador for inclusion and compassion. Beacon, sensing his companion's contemplation, rested his head on her lap. Sarah stroked his ears, whispering, "Thank you, friend, for teaching me to see beyond appearances and for showing me that sometimes the brightest lights come from the most unexpected places." Outside, the lights of Geneva twinkled, reflecting on the waters of the lake. For Sarah and Beacon, it was just the beginning of an exciting new phase in their mission to illuminate the world with love, compassion, and inclusion. The return to the United States after the Geneva Congress marked the beginning of a new era for Sarah, Beacon, and the entire community of Hope Valley. The international repercussion of the event opened doors that no one could have imagined just a few years before. The Animal Assisted Training and Therapy Center, once a local project, now received visits and consultations from experts from all over the world. Delegations from various countries arrived weekly, eager to learn from the model of inclusion and assistance that Sarah and her team had developed. Sarah, now 15 years old, balanced her studies with her growing responsibilities as a global spokesperson for the cause. Her motivational speeches were no longer limited to the universe of assistance animals. She was invited to speak at schools, universities, and even business conferences on topics such as overcoming challenges, innovation, and empathy. On a particularly busy afternoon at the center, Sarah received news that left her breathless. Edward entered her office, yes, she now had her own office, with a broad smile on his face. "Sarah, brace yourself for this. The UN wants to establish an International Assistance Animal Day, and they want you and Beacon to be the official ambassadors of the campaign." The young girl was speechless. "The UN? That's unbelievable." The campaign for International Assistance Animal Day became an ambitious project that mobilized people on all continents. Sarah and Beacon traveled once again, this time visiting developing countries to promote the importance of assistance animals in underprivileged communities. In every place they visited, they left a legacy. In India, they helped establish a guide dog program in Mumbai. In South Africa, they collaborated with a local NGO to train assistance dogs for children with autism. In Mexico, they inaugurated a rehabilitation center that used animal-assisted therapy for patients with spinal cord injuries. Meanwhile, in Hope Valley, The changes were equally profound. The neighborhood, once known for its simplicity, was now a hub of social innovation. The training center expanded, creating jobs and opportunities for the entire community. Mrs. Johnson, proud, now ran an entire department dedicated to manufacturing specialized equipment for assistance animals, exporting to various countries. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. With growing fame came challenges. Sarah faced the pressure of being such a young public figure, balancing the demands of her mission with the desire to have a normal adolescence. Beacon, although still active and healthy, was beginning to show subtle signs of aging. It was during a quiet afternoon in the backyard of her home, away from the spotlight and cameras, that Sarah had an epiphany. Sitting under the old oak tree, with Beacon resting by her side, she realized that the true legacy of her journey wasn't in the awards, speeches, or international programs. "You know, Beacon," she whispered, stroking the now slightly graying fur of her faithful companion, "I think I finally understood. What we did wasn't just about you or me. It was about showing the world that everyone has value, that everyone deserves a chance." At that moment, Sarah decided it was time to pass the torch. In the months that followed, she worked tirelessly to establish a mentoring program, training young people from all over the United States to become ambassadors for the cause of assistance animals. International Assistance Animal Day, when it was finally inaugurated, became a global celebration of inclusion and empathy. Sarah and Beacon were the guests of honor at an emotional ceremony at the UN headquarters in New York. Before an audience that included world leaders, activists, and people whose lives had been transformed by assistance animals, Sarah gave her most important speech. "A few years ago, I found an abandoned blind puppy and thought I was saving a life. What I didn't know was that that little being was about to save countless lives, including mine. Beacon taught me that our inner light shines brightest when we illuminate the path for others. Today, we celebrate not just assistance animals, but the human capacity to see beyond limitations, to find strength in diversity, and to build a world where everyone has a chance to shine." Sarah's words echoed around the world, broadcast in dozens of languages. On the giant screens behind her, images of Beacon over the years succeeded one another, from the small frightened puppy to the confident dog that inspired millions. Back in Hope Valley, the community gathered to watch the live broadcast of the ceremony. Tears of pride and joy flowed freely. That story that had begun in a simple backyard had transformed into a global movement. In the years that followed, Beacon's legacy continued to grow. Training centers based on the Hope Valley model emerged in various countries. Laws for the protection and appreciation of assistance animals were passed on several continents. And most importantly, people's mentality began to change, with greater awareness of the importance of inclusion and respect for differences. Sarah, now a young adult, continued her work, albeit in a more discreet manner. She dedicated herself to writing books, producing documentaries, and guiding the new generation of activists. Beacon, in his serene old age, remained by her side, a constant reminder of where it all began. On a quiet afternoon, sitting on the porch of her home in Hope Valley, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey she had lived. Beacon, now an elderly dog, rested peacefully at her feet. She smiled, thinking about how a simple act of compassion had triggered a wave of changes that continued to spread throughout the world. "Look at that, Beacon," she murmured, stroking the ears of her old friend. "Who would have thought that a little blind dog and a girl from a simple neighborhood could change the world? But I guess that was always the lesson, wasn't it? That true light comes from within, and that we all have the power to illuminate the path for others." As the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Sarah felt a deep gratitude for Beacon, for her experiences, for the challenges and victories, but above all for the opportunity to have made a difference, to have shown the world that love, compassion, and determination can indeed move mountains. And so, in the quietness of that afternoon, with the soft sound of Beacon's breathing as background music, Sarah understood that her work, far from being finished, was a constant invitation to continue spreading light, hope, and inclusion throughout the world. End of story. If by chance this story touched you, consider helping us through a donation in the Super Thanks option here on YouTube. What may be little for you is a lot for us and helps us continue with more exciting stories.